Marcus Reed walked into the headquarters of Langford Dynamics wearing a worn suit, scuffed shoes, and a leather briefcase bought second-hand more than a decade earlier. The chief executive, Victoria Langford, looked him over from collar to sole and laughed in front of the hiring panel before saying,
"We do not hire poor men."
Marcus did not lower his eyes. He set a sealed envelope on the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and answered,
I am not here to ask for a job. I am here to replace you.
The room went silent, and Victoria had no idea that the signature inside that envelope could end her reign before the day was over. If you want to watch an arrogant executive lose the chair she believed no one could ever take from her, tap subscribe now and stay with me, because every twist in this story lands harder than the one before it. The morning before all of that, Marcus stood in the small kitchen of his rented house on the edge of town with one shoe in his hand, turning it toward the window light. The stitching along the sole had begun to separate near the toe, a thin gray smile opening a little wider every week. He had priced a new pair twice. Both times he had closed the browser because he had just paid his daughter's tuition, and the number left in his account did not leave room for pride. He pressed the sole flat with his thumb, set the shoe down, and told himself it would hold one more day. His daughter, Kayla, 16 years old and sharper than most adults ever gave her credit for, leaned against the doorway with a bowl of cereal and watched him straighten his collar in the hallway mirror. She asked if he was nervous. Marcus looked at his own reflection for a second longer than he meant to, then told her the truth as he understood it. He was not going there to beg. He was going there to be heard. Kayla nodded like that answer settled something in her and told him to text her when it was over. His phone buzzed as he reached for his keys. The message was encrypted, short, and from a woman named Helen Mercer, the independent chair of the Langford board. Come to the executive floor. Tell no one why you are coming. Not the receptionist, not anyone on the executive team. Marcus read it twice, put the phone in his pocket, picked up the cracked leather briefcase, and walked out into a morning that would end with a woman who had erased him from an industry, learning his name all over again. What Marcus knew, and what almost no one inside that building knew, was that the board of Langford Dynamics had been quietly running a search for an interim chief executive for weeks. The company was drifting toward a breach of a major credit agreement, close enough that lawyers had started drafting language nobody wanted to read out loud. One of its largest manufacturing contracts had already walked out the door, and the board had made one decision above all the others. Whoever replaced Victoria Langford would be chosen without her fingerprints anywhere on the process. Not her shortlist, not her interviews, not her successor. When Marcus reached the lobby, the receptionist looked up. She saw a black man in a jacket with softened cuffs, shoes with the shine worn off them, and a briefcase cracked at the corners, and she made her decision in about a second and a half. She asked no questions. She simply printed a visitor badge, slid it across the counter, and told him someone from facilities would come down for him. The badge said maintenance candidate. Marcus looked at it, clipped it to his lapel exactly where it belonged, and said thank you. He did not argue. Arguing with the badge would have wasted the only thing he had brought with him that mattered, and it was not in the badge. It was in the envelope. Victoria had seen his name on the visitor log that morning. The memory attached to it was thin, the way a memory gets when a person has been deliberately filed away. A plant manager, years ago, some trouble at Red Creek that had gone quiet on its own. He had disappeared from the industry entirely afterward, which she had always taken as proof that he had never been worth much to begin with. She decided not to let an assistant handle the formality. She would go down herself. A few minutes of her presence, she was certain, would be enough to remind the man exactly where he stood. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor, and Marcus recognized her instantly. The same woman who had pushed him out nearly a decade earlier. Nothing in his posture moved. A junior staffer, trying to be helpful, asked which position he had come to discuss, whether it was maintenance, warehouse logistics, or one of the driving routes. Marcus answered that he had come for the position he had been invited to interview for. Nothing more, nothing less. Through the glass wall of the conference room, he could see the board already seated, papers squared in front of them, waiting. For a moment, it looked as though he would simply walk in and take the empty chair. Then Victoria stepped into the doorway, filled it with her shoulder, and gave him a smile that did not reach her eyes. Before anyone wasted the board's time, she said, she wanted a word with him alone. She studied him again, slower this time, letting everyone nearby watch her do it. The fraying cuffs, the dull shoes, the briefcase. And she asked, loud enough for the assistant still standing there, whether people like him understood what kind of image a company like Langford Dynamics had to project to investors. Derek Shaw, the chief financial officer, had drifted in behind her, and he added that a leader needed to look like a man who belonged in a room full of institutional money, not a man who had wandered in off a bus stop bench. Marcus asked evenly whether competence was measured before or after the price tag on a suit. Victoria's expression tightened. She told him plainly that Langford Dynamics was not a charity. Then she said the words that would follow her for the rest of that day and every day after it. We do not hire poor men. Two junior staffers exchanged a look. One let out a short, nervous laugh and immediately regretted it. And at the back of the room, Dana Brooks, the head of human resources, stood with her arms folded, visibly uncomfortable, and said absolutely nothing. Marcus did not raise his voice. He slid the sealed envelope across the table, the board's official seal facing up, and told her he had not come to be hired by her. He had come to replace her. Victoria laughed outright, called him delusional, and told the two security officers by the elevator to escort him out of the building. Before either guard took a step, Helen Mercer walked in, unhurried, and told them to stand down. She confirmed in front of everyone present that Marcus Reed was the final candidate in a confidential process to select an interim chief executive. A process opened after the board discovered that the company's reported cash position was short by hundreds of millions of dollars against what had been filed with its lenders, and that no one on the executive team had explained the gap. Victoria's composure cracked. She demanded to know why such a process had been running without her knowledge. Helen answered without raising her voice that a sitting chief executive does not get to choose her own potential successor. Inside the envelope was a signed board authorization granting Marcus 48 hours of full access to the company's operational records, enough time to complete the independent evaluation the board itself had ordered. Victoria pulled herself back together just enough to say she looked forward to interviewing him properly. But the look in her eyes made her real plan clear. She did not intend to evaluate him. She intended to destroy his credibility before those 48 hours ran out. She turned the rest of the meeting into an interrogation of his past. Martin Cole, the company's chief legal counsel, produced a personnel file claiming Marcus had been terminated years earlier for violating internal procedure, leaking confidential documents, causing significant damage at a manufacturing site, and making unsubstantiated accusations of financial fraud against his superiors. Victoria asked with theatrical concern why the board would even consider a man the company had once fired for dishonesty. Marcus answered without lifting his voice. He had never been fired. He had resigned after refusing to sign a quality report he knew to be false. 8 years earlier at the Red Creek manufacturing plant, inspectors had found a serious defect in a production line at the exact moment Victoria was pushing to close a lucrative contract, and she had asked him to delay the report until after the signing. He refused. He forwarded his own written warning directly to the legal department instead. Within weeks, his personnel record was quietly altered, and the man who had saved that plant from closure became, on paper, the man who had sabotaged it. Martin insisted the archive held only the current version of the file, and that Marcus could prove none of it. Victoria went further, because she thought further was where he would break. She said a man who had lost his house and now ran a small consulting shop out of a rented office had no business leading a corporation of Langford's size. Marcus told her, without flinching, that he had sold his house to cover his late wife's medical care while she was ill, and that he had raised his daughter alone every year since. He was not saying it for sympathy. He was saying it because Victoria was confusing a man's financial setbacks with his character, and those two things had never once been the same. Helen finally cut in and told Victoria the questioning had crossed from scrutiny into cruelty. What that altered file never recorded was the 11 months Marcus spent rebuilding the Red Creek line from the ground up, sleeping in his truck on some nights so he could catch equipment failures before the morning shift walked in. The workers there trusted him because he never once acted like the job was beneath him. When his wife's diagnosis came, he kept working through the worst of it, driving 4 hours each way between the hospital and the plant floor because he refused to let either one fail. The house he eventually sold was not a mansion, just a modest 3-bedroom place with a swing set Kayla had already outgrown before the movers arrived. Victoria had known enough of his situation at the time to guess he would be too depleted to fight. What she never accounted for was that grief does not erase memory, and Marcus had kept his own copies of every warning email he sent about the defect, sitting untouched in a personal account nobody at Langford ever thought to check. That evening, alone in her office, Dana Brooks opened a small personal safe and took out a data drive she had kept hidden for years. On it was a copy of Marcus Reed's original, unaltered personnel file. She remembered the afternoon she had been told to update his termination reason without explanation, and she remembered choosing, out of fear for her own job, not to ask why. For years, she had told herself it was not her responsibility to correct a record she had not written. Sitting there with the drive in her hand, she finally understood that her silence had been its own kind of authorship all along. The next morning, Victoria proposed that the evaluation take place at the West Bridge manufacturing facility, the site generating the largest share of the company's unexplained losses. She was confident a man who had been out of the industry for years would be lost among systems he no longer understood. Derek had already prepared a sanitized set of figures for him, numbers scrubbed of inventory that did not exist, invoices left unpaid for months, warranty costs quietly rising, and a return rate buried in a footnote. Marcus set the spreadsheets down without opening them and walked straight onto the production floor. He talked to shift supervisors. He watched the physical flow of material instead of trusting a screen. Senior managers snickered at his shoes when he crouched beside a conveyor line, but a few longtime workers recognized him immediately as the man who had pulled Red Creek back from the edge. Within hours, he had 3 things that did not add up. A production line listed as fully operational that had been dead for weeks. Inventory counted twice across 2 separate warehouses, and a critical parts supplier who had stopped shipping altogether because his invoices had gone unpaid for months. Langford Dynamics was not short on revenue the way the reports claimed. It was short on cash because Derek had been concealing what the company actually owed. Then Victoria arrived with an internal camera crew. She had brought them for one purpose. The company ran a live internal feed to every facility, every break room, every screen on every floor, and she intended to use it to broadcast Marcus Reed looking obsolete in front of the entire workforce. She asked him, in front of dozens of employees, whether he needed someone to walk him through equipment meant for grown professionals. Uneasy laughter moved through the crowd. Marcus glanced at the camera and asked the operator one question. "Is the red light on?" The operator said yes. They were live company-wide. "Good," Marcus said. Then he asked the floor manager to start the line the official report listed as running at full capacity. Nobody moved. Then somebody tried. The panel lit, the interlock held, and the line did not turn over because a critical component had been pulled out weeks earlier to repair a different line entirely. The silence carried through the plant and out through the feed to every screen in the company. Marcus said simply that the production figures on that report were physically impossible. And when Victoria turned to blame a subordinate, he pointed out that her own signature sat at the bottom of the approval page. She ordered the feed cut. It was cut. It was already far too late because thousands of employees had just watched their chief executive prove her own numbers were a lie, and the only question left in that building was how much else had been hidden the exact same way. As they walked off the floor, a shift supervisor fell into step beside Marcus and pressed a folded printout into his hand without breaking stride. It was a copy of an email employees had sent months earlier, warning Victoria about the exact shutdown Marcus had just uncovered. The reply, sent from her office, instructed them to keep the matter quiet and route no further messages about it. Before he left Westbridge that day, Marcus asked to see the maintenance logs going back a full year. The regional manager's face changed when he heard the request, and the logs told Marcus why. Repair tickets had been submitted, then withdrawn, again and again. Not because anyone fixed the problem, because approving a repair meant admitting on the record how long the line had actually been down. He walked the length of the facility with the plant's oldest supervisor, a woman who had worked that floor for more than 20 years. She told him quietly that morale had been collapsing for months, that experienced workers were leaving for competitors who at least paid on time, and that the ones who stayed did so because they could not afford to gamble on somewhere new. Marcus asked whether anyone had ever reported the problems upward. She said they had, more than once, and every time they were told leadership was already aware and that raising it further would be treated as insubordination. He thanked her and wrote nothing down in front of her, out of respect for the risk she had just taken. He waited until he was alone in the parking lot before recording what she had said. It was the kind of thing no spreadsheet could hold, the plain human cost of a company that cared more about how it looked than about the people keeping it running, and it stayed with him longer than any falsified number. Back at headquarters that night, Marcus was working through the company's internal systems when something stopped him cold. There was a turnaround framework the company used across every struggling site, one Victoria had spent years presenting as her signature achievement. He recognized it line by line because he had written it. 8 years earlier, running operations at Red Creek, he had built what he privately called the recovery model, a structured approach to rescuing failing plants that had pulled that facility back from the edge of closure. After he left, his name was stripped from every internal document. The plan was rebranded under a corporate label carrying Victoria's imprint. She used it to win a leadership award, and that award carried her the rest of the way to the chief executive's chair. Marcus still had his original draft. Martin Cole dismissed it with a shrug, saying a personal file carried no legal weight against years of corporate documentation bearing her name. The next day, Victoria arranged a lunch with several board members for the sole purpose of undermining him. She described Marcus as a bitter former employee trying to claim credit for work he never did, a man who had failed to build anything of his own and had come back to take what belonged to someone who had. She mocked the idea that a man running a small consulting shop out of a rented office deserved to sit anywhere near a corporate boardroom. Then, when the plates were cleared, she made her offer. A substantial consulting payment paid immediately in exchange for withdrawing from consideration and signing an agreement never to discuss anything he had found. She framed it as generosity toward a man who was clearly struggling. Marcus turned it down without a pause. He told her he had once walked away from a fight to protect his family, and he had lived with that decision every day since. This time, staying quiet would not cost him his reputation. It would cost thousands of employees their jobs. Victoria's voice went cold. She told him poor men usually had a lower price than they realized. Marcus answered that a man who has never had much money understands the value of every dollar far better than a woman who has never once known what it means to go without. Across the building, Dana Brooks was coming apart quietly. She knew what the file had said before it was changed. She knew Marcus Reed had once been rated among the strongest operational leaders the company had ever employed. She started pulling up the old archive records, telling herself she was only confirming what she already remembered. Martin Cole saw the access flags the same afternoon. He walked into her office, closed the door, and reminded her of the confidentiality clauses in her employment contract. He told her that speaking about personnel records from 8 years ago would end her career, and that no one would hire a human resources director who leaked files. Dana said nothing. She went home, sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes, and did not open the safe. Marcus worked late that night. Deep in the company's server records, he found what Martin had insisted did not exist. Metadata from 8 years earlier showing edit histories under Victoria Langford's own account. Internal messages instructing staff to strip his name from the recovery documentation entirely. Timestamps. Authors. A paper trail that had been sitting in the system the whole time because nobody had ever expected a man in worn shoes to know where to look. He moved to preserve the records. At that exact moment, his access was revoked. Within minutes, Martin Cole appeared at the door with a security escort, accusing him of attempting to steal proprietary company data and demanding the board remove him from consideration immediately. Marcus was walked back into the boardroom to find his credentials already suspended, and Martin announced with visible satisfaction that they now had more than sufficient grounds to bar him from the building permanently. He told the assembled board that Marcus had accessed data far beyond the scope of his authorization, copied protected intellectual property, and contacted employees without clearance. Victoria demanded the review be terminated on the spot. Marcus did not defend himself. He asked Martin to read aloud the exact scope of authorization spelled out in the sealed letter the board had given him 2 days earlier. Martin read it reluctantly, and the language left no room at all. Full access to any documentation necessary to evaluate the honesty of the company's operational reporting. Marcus then said the thing that turned the room. His access had been cut off at the precise moment he found evidence of wrongdoing. That timing did not suggest a security concern. It suggested the executive team was obstructing a review the board had formally ordered. Helen Mercer requested an independent system log from the technology department, pulled directly with no executive involvement. The log settled everything. Martin had not only revoked Marcus's access, he had also issued an order to permanently delete an entire archive folder, an act no security procedure explained, no matter how he tried to frame it. And Marcus had never downloaded a single file to a personal device. The moment he found the metadata, he had submitted a formal preservation request to the board's independent oversight server. That request was already logged, time-stamped, and untouchable when Martin's deletion order went out. Which meant Martin's action no longer looked like protecting company secrets. It looked like destroying evidence. Victoria moved away from him instantly, insisting she had known nothing about any deletion order. Martin turned and stared at her. The alliance that had run that executive floor for the better part of a decade broke in front of the entire board, and everyone saw it happen. Marcus pressed forward with his findings while the room was still off balance. He laid out inventory counted twice across 2 warehouses, one on the East Coast and one near Westbridge. The same batch tracked under separate codes, inflating reported assets enough to satisfy the lenders on paper while changing nothing about the cash actually in the accounts. He explained overdue invoices that were never logged as past due, but rolled forward into a holding account that never appeared on the standard reporting dashboard, which made obligations that were months late look current to anyone who did not know where to look. He explained warranty claims from a defective batch of components, split into smaller amounts and scattered across unrelated cost centers so that no single line would draw an auditor's eye. And he explained the last piece, the human one, that employees who saw any of it had been discouraged, and in some cases directly threatened, out of reporting what they knew. None of this required brilliance to hide, he said. It only required a willingness to look away, and a system built so that almost nobody ever saw the whole picture at once. Derek Shaw called it a difference in accounting methodology, a matter of interpretation. Nothing more. Marcus asked that the company's primary lender be called right there, on speaker, in front of the board. The call connected. The bank's representative confirmed plainly that Langford Dynamics would breach its loan covenants the moment its true financial position was reported. Not eventually, immediately. Derek's hands were shaking by the time the call ended, and he was still insisting weakly that every adjustment had been made to protect jobs rather than deceive anyone. Martin made one last move. He argued the board had no authority to remove a sitting chief executive without a formal cause hearing. a process that would take weeks to schedule. Helen reminded him, without any heat at all, that the bylaws he was citing had been amended to allow an emergency suspension the moment a credible threat to solvency was identified. He had drafted that amendment himself. He fell silent, unable to argue with language written in his own hand. Victoria watched the room turn against her, one voice at a time. Then she made her final argument, and it was the only one she had left. Marcus Reed knew how to tear a company apart, she said. He had no idea how to lead one. Helen accepted the challenge and handed it straight to Marcus. 12 hours. A workable plan that kept the company operating without mass layoffs. Victoria was certain he would be forced to choose between bankruptcy and gutting the workforce, and that the choice would finally expose him. That night, Marcus started calling suppliers he had worked with personally years ago. Most declined. Langford's word had been worth nothing to them for a long time. Then one agreed to come back under a single condition, stated flatly. Victoria Langford could no longer hold authority to sign contracts on the company's behalf. Before the room had adjourned, Victoria had gotten in one more shot, saying that a man who could not keep his own house had no business fixing a corporation's debt. Marcus had answered quietly that he lost his house because he chose his family over everything else, and she was about to lose her company because she chose her chair over everyone in it. He worked until midnight. He did not propose selling manufacturing sites. He did not propose layoffs. He cut from the top instead. Sell the corporate jet. Sell 2 underused executive properties that existed purely for comfort, which alone covered nearly 1/3 of the immediate shortfall. End the vanity projects that had never generated $1 of measurable revenue. Close the executive floor's private dining service and return the fleet of leased vehicles reserved for senior staff, because, as he told one junior analyst who asked, those things had never once appeared on a customer invoice or a factory paycheck, so they would be the first to go. Claw back bonuses that had been paid on falsified figures. Extend payment terms with suppliers willing to work with the company again, which closed most of the remaining gap. Separate financial oversight from the Langford family's direct control, and reopen 2 contracts canceled the previous year, deals that internal notes showed had collapsed not over price or performance, but because Victoria had taken personal offense when a partner questioned her numbers on a routine call. 90 days. No hourly position touched. He walked the finance team through the math twice, and by morning, even board members who had come in skeptical admitted privately that it was the most coherent recovery plan the company had seen in years. Somewhere in the middle of that long night, Victoria called her father. Arthur Langford had built the company from nothing 40 years earlier, and he arrived at headquarters carrying that weight in the way he walked. Victoria told him Marcus wanted to seize the company out of revenge for old grievances that had nothing to do with the present crisis. Arthur looked at Marcus and saw an opportunist circling something wounded. Marcus did not argue with him. He walked him down to the Hall of Achievements instead, where framed awards celebrated the recovery framework that had built Victoria's early reputation, and he laid his original draft on the table beneath them, along with the tracked revisions bearing her own account signature. Arthur tried to defend her. Executives build on ideas from the people below them, he said. That happens everywhere. Marcus told him the credit was not the point. He said he had never come back for a name on a document. He had come back because his personnel record had been deliberately altered to make him unemployable, so that the one person who first raised the alarm about Red Creek could never be believed again. That was the moment Dana Brooks finally stepped forward. She handed Helen 3 things: Marcus Reed's original, unaltered personnel file, an email in which Martin Cole had instructed staff to rewrite the official reason for his departure, and a message in which Victoria had written that Marcus needed to be made unemployable across the industry so he could never resurface as a threat. Victoria accused her of betraying the company that had employed her for years. Dana answered that she had already betrayed Marcus 8 years earlier through her silence, and she was not willing to carry that weight a second time. Arthur read through the documents slowly. Then he stopped, and his hand went still on the page. There was an electronic signature attached to the original decision to force Marcus out, and it carried his own name. He said quietly that he had never authorized it. He had never even seen it. Victoria admitted it. She had used her father's system credentials because she was certain he would have approved the decision anyway if she had simply asked. Arthur set the papers down. He understood, finally, that his daughter had not only hidden the company's failures, she had used his name and his authority to do it, without ever telling him. He told her he would not cast his vote to protect her. And Victoria smiled, almost triumphantly, because she had planned for exactly this. Months ago, she said, she had signed a proxy agreement transferring voting authority over a portion of the family shares to Derek Shaw. Her father's refusal changed nothing. When the emergency board session opened in the morning, she was certain, she would still have the votes to keep her chair. The emergency board session opened the next morning, with Victoria Langford sitting straighter than she had in 2 days, certain the proxy had already decided everything. Helen Mercer directed both sides to make their case plainly. She asked Victoria to explain why she should remain in her position, and she asked Marcus to show that his proposal came from genuine conviction rather than personal vengeance. Victoria spoke about family legacy. She spoke about the investor relationships she had spent years cultivating, about the doors that opened when she walked through them, about the awards lining the walls of her office, and the reputation those awards carried in rooms Marcus Reed had never been invited into. Marcus spoke about cash flow. He spoke about the people on the factory floor at Westbridge, about suppliers waiting on invoices that were 4 months old, about the operations that had to keep running whether anyone in that room felt comfortable or not, and about trust that would have to be rebuilt from the ground up because it had been spent down to nothing. He admitted openly that he owned no estate, no private jet, and no relationships among the elite circles Victoria moved through so easily. Then he told the board something that landed in the silence and stayed there. A chief executive is not paid to look wealthy. A chief executive is paid to answer for a company when things go wrong. Martin Cole made his move then, invoking the clause that allowed Derek Shaw to cast votes on behalf of the Langford family shares. The board's independent counsel had already read the agreement overnight. She told the room, without drama, that the proxy took effect only under one condition. It activated if Arthur Langford were declared incapable of making his own decisions. Arthur was sitting in that room. He was lucid, present, and entirely capable, and everyone could see it. Derek had no legal grounds to cast a single one of those votes. Cornered, Derek turned on Victoria immediately. He said he had followed her direct instructions, that every adjustment, every rolled invoice, every scattered warranty charge had come from her office, and that he had never done anything on his own initiative. Victoria's composure finally broke. She accused everyone in the room of betraying her family's legacy, of turning on the name that had paid their salaries for years, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched until even Derek seemed unsure whether to fill it. Arthur Langford rose from his chair, slower than he once might have. He told his daughter that the legacy she kept invoking had never belonged to a title or a signature. It belonged to the people who clocked in every morning, trusting that the name on the building meant something. He said he had spent 40 years building a company he could be proud of, and the last several watching that pride get traded away for headlines and awards that no longer meant what they once did. Victoria tried to interject. Her father raised a hand, not unkindly, and said he was not finished. Protecting her had once felt like the only right thing to do, he told her. But protecting her mistakes was not the same as protecting her, and he was done confusing the two. Marcus spoke last, and he kept it short. He reminded the board that Langford Dynamics had stopped being a private family possession the moment it accepted capital from shareholders, credit from lenders, and the labor of thousands of employees who depended on it to feed their households. Nobody in that room, himself included, was owed a chair because of where they had started or how far they had climbed. The only question worth asking was whether the company and its people would be better off for the decision. The vote was tallied. Victoria Langford was suspended from her role as chief executive. Martin Cole was suspended pending a formal investigation. Derek Shaw was stripped of all financial authority, and Marcus Reed was appointed interim chief executive for a period of 90 days. Victoria found him afterward, and there was a bitter edge in her voice when she asked whether it satisfied him to watch a poor man take the chair she had built her entire life around. Marcus told her he had not taken her chair at all. Her own decisions were what left it empty. That afternoon, he stood in front of the executive chair and did not sit down right away. His first order as interim chief executive was to open the boardroom doors to employee representatives and supplier delegates, people who had never once been invited inside during Victoria's tenure. There was no purge. He did not fire anyone in anger. The people who had knowingly taken part in falsifying records were suspended through proper procedure, with documentation and review. The employees who had stayed silent for years out of fear were given a channel to come forward without consequence, and dozens of them used it within the first week. The 90-day plan went into effect immediately. Transparent reporting, with the holding account eliminated entirely. The most urgent debts settled first, starting with the supplier who had stopped shipping. The internal reporting line, quietly dismantled years earlier, restored and staffed. The private dining service closed, the leased executive fleet returned, the jet listed for sale. Jobs protected at every manufacturing site. He also instructed human resources to strip the hiring criteria of anything tied to background, home address, prestigious schooling, or personal appearance. Competence would be the only measure that mattered. Dana Brooks was assigned to rebuild the company's whistleblower protections. She understood clearly that the assignment was not forgiveness. She still had to answer for the years she had spent quiet, and Marcus never pretended otherwise. Arthur Langford apologized to Marcus for trusting a falsified file instead of looking for the truth himself. Marcus did not ask him for more power in return. He asked only that the Langford family stop treating the company as though it belonged to them alone, and Arthur stepped back from daily control without argument. In the weeks that followed, Marcus made a point of visiting every major facility in person rather than relying on regional reports. Some on the executive floor called it old-fashioned and inefficient. He told his new leadership team that numbers could be shaped to say almost anything, but a factory floor rarely lied to a person willing to walk it slowly and ask honest questions. At Westbridge, he personally approved funding to repair the line that had sat dead for months, and he made sure the supervisor who had spoken to him honestly in that hallway received recognition instead of the quiet punishment she had spent 20 years learning to expect. Word of those visits spread quickly, not because anyone announced them, but because employees who had grown used to being invisible suddenly found themselves being asked directly what they needed to do their jobs well. Victoria left the building through the main lobby, the same space where employees had watched her mock a man in worn shoes. No one mocked her in return. The silence that followed her out the door carried more weight than any insult could have. Before she left, she asked whether he intended to strip the Langford name from the company entirely. He told her that a family's name does not create a company's honor. The way that company treats the people inside it does. 3 months later, Langford Dynamics avoided defaulting on its loan agreements and won back several of the contracts it had lost during Victoria's final year. The board voted unanimously to make Marcus's appointment permanent. Dana's reckoning did not end with one act of honesty in a boardroom. She spent those months rebuilding the reporting channel she had watched wither, meeting personally with employees who had been afraid for years, slowly earning back a measure of trust she knew she was not entitled to demand. Arthur stayed close enough to watch his daughter's old office get repainted and reassigned to a quality assurance team that had spent years working out of a cramped basement room. He never spoke publicly about any of it, but people noticed he had grown quieter, more inclined to listen before offering an opinion. During the first round of hiring interviews conducted under his leadership, Marcus noticed a nervous candidate waiting in the hallway in a jacket that had clearly seen better days. He told the receptionist to treat that candidate exactly the way any other qualified applicant would be treated. No exceptions, no side glances, no assumptions. He came home late that evening in the same worn suit. Kayla was at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her, and she asked how the interview had gone. Marcus set 2 badges down on the table between them. The first said, Maintenance Candidate. The second carried his name with the title, Chief Executive, printed underneath it. He told her he got the job. Kayla looked at the second badge for a while. She did not seem surprised at all. She told him she had always known what he was capable of. She just could not understand why it took people with that much money so long to see it. The next morning, Marcus laced up the same old shoes, the soles stitched back together at a shop 3 blocks from the house. He could afford new ones now. He wore the old pair anyway and walked out the door toward the building he ran, because he never wanted to forget what it feels like to be judged before anyone bothers to ask what you can actually do. That is the whole thing in the end. A suit can be replaced. A pair of shoes can be replaced. Character cannot be bought, borrowed, or printed on a badge. And the people who understand that are almost never the ones asking you to prove it. If this story reached you, tell me in the comments where you are listening from today. And if you believe dignity should be recognized before a price tag is, subscribe and stay with me, because there are plenty more stories like this one waiting.